Welcome to Khanversations. I'm Muqtedar Khan, your host. And as you can see with us, we have a very distinguished scholar, Dr. Sumit Ganguly, who is the Rabindranath Tagore Chair at University of Indiana in Bloomington. All my life, I've been reading Professor Ganguly. And I know I might upset a few people, and those few people are just two or three probably, when I say that Dr. Ganguly is perhaps the most prominent scholar on Indian foreign policy and South Asia, and he has been so for quite a while. He has over 20 books which he has written or edited or co-edited on the subject. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, which is right here in Philadelphia. He's also been a visiting scholar at the Army War College. He is editor of, or is on the editorial board of some significant security journals. And he is also very well known in security studies besides the foreign policy issues. So during the course of this conversation, I will be sharing a lot of Dr. Ganguly's books so that you can also look at them. I will post a link to his author page on Amazon in the video description, so you can go and get some of his books. And he's here today to talk about his chapter in the edited volume that I've published with New Lines Institute, titled The Rise of India as a World Power. Dr. Ganguly's title is also very similar to the book, but with a question mark at the end of it. So welcome to Khanversations, Professor Ganguly.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm going to dive right away into the first question. But before that, I often forget to say these things, but this is what I call office work. For those of you who are watching Khanversations, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Make sure you like the video, press the bell icon. And then after you have enjoyed the talk, please share this with your social and academic network. And those of you who like to support Khanversations, please join the channel, and you can see the join button right next to the subscribe button. Professor Ganguly, my first question to you is about the 4 things that you identify in your chapter as potential barriers to India fully realizing its potential as a world power. One of that was the perception that the US is, that India has some hesitancy and suspicion with regards to the United States, which it seems to have overcome to a great extent, but apparently it is still lingering. The second one is you're worried about domestic issues such as poverty and also environmental consequences of India's rapid development. The third barrier you hint at is the rise of India's lurch towards authoritarianism. And the fourth one that you talk about is India's failure to terminate its rivalry with Pakistan. So my question to you, sir, is very simple. Do you think that there is a chance that India's rise to power could be derailed by any of these challenges that it faces?
There's no question in my mind that one or more of these challenges that I have identified in my chapter could derail India's rise. One of the major issues that still confronts Indian foreign policy is its inability to come to terms with the fact that the world has changed significantly since the Cold War, and the US is in a markedly different position vis-a-vis India than it was during the Cold War. And the US is prepared to engage India along multiple fronts, not just security and the rise of China, but it's a multifaceted relationship today and quite different from the Cold War years. And my fear is that India may be losing an opportunity to cement this relationship with the United States, which could thereby facilitate India's rise in the global order. And the hesitation about cementing this relationship could prove to be quite costly for India in the long term.
With regards to the lurch towards authoritarianism, you make a very interesting point that not all democracies become major powers, and not all major powers and world powers are democracies. So while you make note of the fact that India is lurching towards authoritarianism, do you fear that that could, at least in the India specific case, derail India's economic and shall we say, political and geopolitical rise?
Yes, I believe so, because for all its flaws, Indian democracy provided a safety valve for discontent in India, and discontent stemming from poverty, from inequality, from regional tensions, from religious differences. It always provided this avenue for the expression of discontent, and thereby enabled India to cohere. If India continues to move in this authoritarian direction and becomes a highly centralized, top-down polity, these avenues for the expression of discontent, for expressing unhappiness, will be significantly curbed, and authoritarianism will not be a panacea for the many fissures that exist in Indian society, which have periodically bubbled up. And after all, Indira Gandhi tried this in the late 1970s with disastrous results, and at an enormous social and human cost. And that lesson should be learned by the current leadership of India, which doesn't seem to understand that a centralized polity is not an appropriate form of organization for a country as inherently diverse as India.
You know, sir, one of the interesting things that President Biden has been trying to pose is his view of the world as essentially divided into this authoritarian camp and the democracy camp. So, in that context, this emerging geopolitical contest with China kind of fits very neatly, with China as the leader of the authoritarian world and the U.S. as the leader of the democratic world. But if India were to become more and more authoritarian, which camp will it fit in? I mean, how could it be pals with democracies and also become more and more authoritarian?
Yes, I think there's a fundamental tension there that you have identified. Of course, the US continues to work with various authoritarian states when it finds it convenient. I mean, look at our relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is hardly a model of pluralism and openness and an exemplar of human rights. And yet, Biden has found it expedient to work with Saudi Arabia. That being said, the U.S. may continue to work with India, but I think the two issues will probably undermine the relationship. One, while Biden and much of the administration is counting on India to be a balancer against China, if India fails to deliver on that issue and continues this authoritarian lurch, then its utility to the United States will be significantly diminished. And at some point, the US will walk away. Already, there are various members of Congress, both in the House, more in the House, less in the Senate, who have spoken out about India's drift towards authoritarianism and has critiqued the Biden administration for its unwillingness to forthrightly speak out about some of the more unfortunate developments in India in terms of personal rights and civil liberties and religious tolerance and the freedom of the press and the like.
Yeah, Mr. Biden has personally experienced it now. I mean, he, in spite of many requests by Jake Sullivan and the White House staff, he did not get an opportunity to hold a press conference in Delhi after his meeting with Prime Minister Modi. Your last observation in terms of a barrier was India's failure to terminate its rivalry with Pakistan. The way Pakistani foreign policy seem to have functioned for the last 40, 75 years seems to be to basically it's Kashmir oriented and unwilling to make friends with India. I mean, their prime ministers have talked about 1,000 years of hostility and warfare with India. Is there a possibility of India terminating this rivalry? Like, how could India go about doing this without winning a massive, decisive war? And who can predict what happens in a war?
You make a very important point here. Terminating this rivalry will not be easy. There have been moments when the rivalry might have come to a close. And part of the problem is that India has rarely been able to find a reliable interlocutor in Pakistan. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto had a unique opportunity after the 71 war to finally settle the dispute with India. Unfortunately, he frittered away that opportunity. I am not entirely persuaded that General Musharraf was the person who could have delivered. There is a great deal has been written, most of it from the Indian side, about how the two sides had come perilously close to an agreement on Kashmir with this 6-point formula. But an issue that I have raised in my own writing has suggested that did Musharraf have the full-fledged support of all the corps commanders of the Pakistani army who wield a disproportionate amount of power in the Pakistani political system, about their unequivocal support for what Musharraf was trying to accomplish with India. In the absence of their support and our knowledge of that support, I remain somewhat skeptical about whether or not this formula would have actually led to a rapprochement between India and Pakistan. Currently, of course, Pakistan is in a state of complete disarray, politically, economically, diplomatically, and consequently, this is not perhaps the most propitious moment for trying to reach a settlement, because there's no one in Pakistan that could make a credible commitment that any agreement that it reaches with India would be actually upheld and implemented. So I recognize that the barriers to a settlement are extremely difficult from the present standpoint. Nevertheless, I think it is worth pursuing a long-term strategy of a rapprochement with Pakistan, because otherwise Pakistan will remain like an albatross around India's neck. Despite the growing disparities between the two countries, economically, militarily, diplomatically, and the like. Nevertheless, this will remain a constant trying irritant that India will have to cope with, as was demonstrated in Kashmir just about a week ago, with yet another terrorist attack and the deaths of several Indian military personnel.
Yeah, no, I think the Anantnag episode is not yet over. It's been going on for the last 5 days, and it does challenge India's uh, claims about normalization in Kashmir. In the beginning of your chapter, you point out to the fact that the early founders of India were convinced that India was destined to become a great power and play an important role in world politics. It is very interesting. It's like, I mean, Americans developed this manifest destiny and the vision of America as a city on the hill. It took about 100 years. But Indians, I think from day one, seem to have had this perception that India is also a city on the hill that everybody would like to look at. I mean, the words are different. Today we talk about Vishwaguru. So in that context, you did make an interesting observation about Pandit Nehru's foreign policy, where it was ambitious and was not exactly in, shall we say, correspondence to India's material capabilities. So they were looking for an alternative way of asserting their influence. Do you think that that foreign policy, which was, of course, the stature of Nehru went down a lot after the 1962 debacle, but do you think that was the best approach for a country at that time? And do you think it has had a positive impact for India even today?
Elements of that foreign policy certainly were laudable and certainly worthy of admiration. Let me highlight two or three elements thereof. One was obviously Nehru's focus on decolonization. Today, it's almost unthinkable to justify colonial rule. There are a handful of British historians who remain unrepentant and who continue to harp on the virtues of colonial rule. I have little or no use for that palpable nonsense. But Nehru played a vital role in delegitimizing the very idea of colonial rule. In Africa, in Asia, Nehru played a very significant role, and I laud his efforts in that regard. Second, Nehru's unyielding opposition to apartheid in South Africa, which also stemmed from his hostility towards colonialism. Again, a highly worthy cause, and one that, again, I applaud him for. Third, even though he made limited progress in this area, was the call for global nuclear disarmament. In part, it was Nehru's insistence on global nuclear disarmament that led, not entirely, but in part, led to the 1963 partial test ban treaty. There were obviously other factors involved, but he squarely placed the issue of nuclear disarmament on the global agenda, which was not a minor achievement. Fourth, his contribution to UN peacekeeping, a tradition that India, despite changes of government with vastly different ideologies and political orientations, continues to pursue. So I am reluctant to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That yes, there were shortcomings, there were limitations, there were flaws in his policies, but there were also significant achievements.
You know, the YouTube channel has the BBC YouTube channel has recently uploaded Pandit Nehru's first ever television interview, which he gave to BBC. And I watched it, and it was fascinating. I mean, to see an Indian Prime Minister take questions from so many reporters, something that we don't see these days. But what was interesting was on the issue of apartheid, he said that you don't understand. I'm restrained by the fact that I'm Prime Minister of India. If I was not Prime Minister of India, I would have been shouting from rooftops my opposition to these practices, to colonialism, as well as to apartheid. So it was very interesting to say that even though he's done so much for those two causes, he thought he would have done more. He was restrained by his role. I think without doubt that in the past history, India's history, we have had four very prominent prime ministers, Pandit Nehru, Indira Gandhi, Manmohan Singh, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. I wanted to ask you, if you look at how different they have been. I mean, Nehru's is impacted by the War of 62, Indira Gandhi by 1971, and now we see Prime Minister Modi facing the challenge of China, which has actually, in many ways, violated Indian sovereignty twice already in this term. So, from a security perspective and foreign policy perspective, how do you see these three prime ministers? I mean, Manmohan Singh's biggest challenge was the nuclear test and sanctions which came after that. But with these three prime ministers, Nehru, Indira Gandhi, and Modi, how do you see their foreign policies?
I've already made clear my views about Nehru. Sure. Perhaps his greatest shortcoming was his belief that he could somehow reach an understanding or a rapprochement with China, and thereby he brought about in many ways the 1962 debacle, something that he never recovered from. And in fact, by 1964, he had passed away after a second heart attack. Indira Gandhi's foreign policy, contrary to many people, I don't think was that worthy of admiration. She handled the 1971 crisis with considerable skill and dexterity and extraordinary courage. I grant her very high, I give her very high marks for handling of the 71 crisis. But overall, her foreign policy was not that imaginative, nor did it really significantly boost India's standing in the world. In fact, if you think about her legacy, and you think about India at the end of the Cold War, one is reminded of the work of a colleague of mine, Ramesh Thakur, who wrote an important article in Foreign Affairs, where he said that India was neither wealthy nor principled nor important at the end of the Cold War. I'm paraphrasing the title of the article, but that was the import of the article. And in large part, that was Mrs. Gandhi's legacy. India hardly had any friends worth the name, with the possible exception of the Soviet Union and Vietnam. India was really a non-entity in world affairs at the time the Cold War ended. And it is to the credit of people like Atal Bihari Vajpayee and also Manmohan Singh that they managed to steer a very different course, faced with the shock of the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. I give them, both of them, very high marks for fairly deftly negotiating a very different world, improving relations with the United States, opening up India's economy, inviting foreign investment, reaching out to Southeast Asia which India had completely neglected during the Cold War, building a new partnership with Japan. All of this really happened under Vajpayee and Singh, and both of them deserve considerable credit. Modi has been extraordinarily active in the realm of foreign policy and has built upon many of the relationships that had started under Vajpayee and Singh. For example, the relationship with the United States, the relationship with Israel, and simultaneously maintaining very good relations with the Arab world and particularly the Gulf states. And I do give Modi credit for his skillful handling of maintaining a robust strategic partnership with Israel while simultaneously building a complex set of relationships with the Gulf countries. To that extent, I give him credit. But at some point, domestic developments in India, especially given the hostility of his party towards Muslims, could have repercussions on India's ties to the Gulf. The Gulf states have largely overlooked India's domestic shortcomings, but I don't know that they will indefinitely do that. Where Modi has failed is to forge a meaningful and worthwhile policy towards the People's Republic of China. For all his bluster, the Chinese have run roughshod over India, as was demonstrated in the Galwan Valley. And in this regard, both he and Manmohan Singh made a fundamental error. Both of them believed that if you built up a robust economic relationship with China, economic interdependence would serve as a kind of a solvent to the tensions and also enable India to set aside the nettlesome border issue. I wrote that this was a flawed strategy, whether under Singh or under Modi. And sadly, the events of 2020 affirmed my reservations.
Yeah, I mean, India today has $100 billion trade deficit with China. That's quite remarkable. And there is some funny accounting going on in an effort to show the United States as the number one trade partner with India. But I think in 2022, China was the number one trading partner with India. And we will see what happens in 2023. Clearly, the US is forging ahead, and there are some restrictions that India is posting with regards to China, like the laptop ban that or the restrictions on laptop imports. I mean, this is a broad question that I have. But do you see the possibility of a war in South Asia in the near future between India and Pakistan, or India and China, or the worst nightmare where India has to face both of them at the same time? And would the United States then intervene directly on India's behalf?
The last question is the critical one, and it's one that vexes the minds of many Indian decision makers who persistently raise this issue about the reliability of the United States in the event of a conflict with China. Here, I'd like to remind people, many of whom have forgotten, that in 1962, the US did come to the aid of India and, in fact, maintained a security relationship with India until Kissinger's efforts to court China, when Kissinger basically put an end to that security cooperation around 1971. Because of his outreach to China, and he thought India was dispensable at the time. And in a crude realpolitik sense, yes, India was dispensable. And Kissinger could care less about whether India was a democracy or its internal arrangements mattered little or nothing to him, especially given his utterly ignominious role during the East Pakistan crisis and the genocide in East Pakistan.
And if you remember, his comment about all Indians was also quite revealing of his attitude.
Oh, most definitely. And these views were reinforced by the almost criminal-minded president, Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
The two of them were contemptuous of both Mrs. Gandhi and India, and the declassified US documents reveal that that Nixon used unprintable language when talking about Indira Gandhi. But to return to the heart of your question, not only in 1962 and beyond, but also during the Doklam crisis of 2017 in Sikkim, when China was engaged in road building activities in a disputed area. Sorry, not Sikkim, Bhutan. Yeah. And where India came to Bhutan's assistance, the US provided real-time intelligence to India using satellite imagery and did the same thing during the Galwan crisis. And consequently, I am a little more sanguine about the US willingness to come to India's assistance in the event of yet another crisis with China. The likelihood of a crisis with Pakistan, I think, is quite small at the moment, given the significant military disparities between the two countries, and secondly, Pakistan's internal disarray. So I think the likelihood of Pakistan going anything beyond these periodic pinpricks through the use of proxy terrorist forces in Kashmir, I think it's highly unlikely that any of these incidents will spiral into a wider conflict. So the possibilities, I think, are rather small. I worry much more about the PRC, especially under Xi Jinping, who, despite domestic problems and an economic downturn in China, seems absolutely relentless in not only confronting India, but the United States. And thereby, I have a much greater fear that Xi Jinping might make a gross miscalculation along the border and thereby lead his country into a war with India. And where I think I've spoken of the military disparities between Pakistan and India. Now it's time to speak about the disparities between China and India. The Chinese infrastructure along the border is superior. Their troops are better trained, are better equipped, and there's a certain ruthlessness on the part of Xi Jinping that worries me no end. And I'm not sure that India has the requisite military intelligence and infrastructural capabilities to cope with a significant Chinese onslaught.
So I'm sure you read Ashley Tully's article in the Foreign Affairs, in which he seems to imply that what India wants from the US is, look, if we are attacked by China, we definitely want you to come in and help us out. But if you get into a fight with China in Taiwan, there's a pretty good chance that we will not come to your aid. So given this perception, do you think that the United States will be giving Indians assurance to that that no matter what, if you get into a conflict with China, we will help you out. But there's also this issue of who provokes the conflict. You see, in the last few months, there have been lots of statements coming out, including from the defense minister of India and some military generals, this Hindutva-related rhetoric about taking back POK. And then this whole talk with regards to China, that people in India seem to think that China is finished economically and militarily, it is nothing, it is shallow, etc. So this perception with, shall we say, domestic-oriented statements which are irresponsible, India could trigger a conflict with China. And would the US then still support India?
Yes. There have been statements in the recent past from high quarters in India which are needlessly provocative. The notion of seizing all of Kashmir by force is frankly laughable, because that could provoke a wider war with Pakistan, because Pakistan is not going to stand by and watch this happen. And furthermore, I think the global community will look rather with a jaundiced eye towards India if India were to embark on such a reckless enterprise. And the notion that China is faced with an economic crisis that will immediately diminish its capabilities, particularly military capabilities, borders on the laughable. Yes, there is an economic downturn in China. China is faced with the burst of a major housing bubble. It could possibly even go into a recession. Its access to certain markets has been curbed largely because of its own behavior. But it has an economy that is 6 times the size of India's economy. Its innovative capacity in certain areas is now challenging the United States. It has important components of a global supply chain. And let's not wish these things away. This is silly nationalist rhetoric on the part of India, especially as the 2024 elections approach. But these claims are not based in reality. And one needs to be suitably cautious and circumspect about these things. China remains a formidable power, however diminished it might be in the wake of COVID and economic mismanagement and overstretch. It nevertheless remains a significant and formidable adversary, and it would be extraordinarily risky and foolish for India's leadership to think otherwise and to score political points with an eye cocked on the 2024 elections.
Professor Ganguly, thank you very much for your candid answers to the questions and very thoughtful analysis of the situation. I think that going forward, we are going to see some major developments in the region. I have a pet theory that I want to bounce off you as my last question. I feel that if India does not, that India and China both do not come to some kind of accommodation quickly, then this century will remain America's century, and India will become an instrument of perpetuating US and Western hegemony by trying to contain China. However, if India and China come to an accommodation very soon in the next 4 or 5 years, then the 21st century will be the Asian century, when these two countries can then openly trade with each other and with ASEAN, and the promise of Asian economic resurgence is more likely to be fulfilled. So this relationship between this trio, India, China, India, US, US, China, is going to determine the future of this century. And I think India is the kingmaker.
The problem is that I don't see any possible resolution in the foreseeable future to the Sino-Indian rivalry, primarily because China will not visualize or see India as an equal. They see India largely as an upstart. And India needs to be kept confined to South Asia and not rise anywhere beyond South Asia and extend its influence across Asia and beyond. And consequently, the possibilities of a breakthrough or a rapprochement or any kind of meaningful understanding between China and India is extremely unlikely. And in fact, this is exactly the argument that two colleagues and I have just made in a book that came out in July on the Sino-Indian rivalry. We see the rivalry as fairly deep-seated and deeply rooted, and China's unwillingness to accommodate India will be the determinative factor in Sino-Indian relations for looking over the immediate horizon.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Ganguly, and congratulations on this book and the other one that you were, which I will be sharing with my viewers. And for those of you who have watched this very interesting conversation, please subscribe to Khanversations if you have not already done so. Like the video, press the bell icon. Do join the channel if you can. Until next time, then I'm your host, Muqtedar Khan. Be happy, be peaceful, and thank you very much, Professor Ganguly.
Thank you again for this opportunity.